Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
This is Demai chapter 2, Halacha 2. We're going to get into a really interesting sugya. So before we were talking about the Amor Aretz. In other words, all of what we were covering so far is going to be, with the laws of the Amor Aretz. What do you do with the Amor Aretz when, they're dealing with food? Now we're going to get into slightly different topic, and that's going to be the theme that carries over for a lot of chapter 2. It's going to be the person who's going to be trusted with respect to tithes. Who is that going to be? Who can you trust? Who's going to be, like you go over to their house and they're trusted for tithes, so you don't need to tithe off of the plate, for example. Who is going to be in that status? Well, I want to just start off this Mishnah with a really interesting list from the Chazan Ish in his Shvius 10.9 commentary on who exactly is an Amor Aretz. What's going to be the category of an Amor Aretz? Who is it? What makes somebody an Amor Aretz? So the Chazan Ish said that in Bavli Berachot 47b, there's a lot of definitions on the term of the Amor Aretz, and it concludes that one who studies Scripture and Mishnah, but he does not study Gemara and get a true comprehension of the Torah, is considered an Amor Aretz. And the Rashi over there agrees with that. And the Chazan Ish continues, and he says that, moreover, someone who does not recite the Shema in both the evening and the morning, does not put on tefillin, does not have tzitzis on his garment, does not have a mezuzah on his door, or has sons and raise them up to study Torah, is going to be considered an Amor Aretz. And moreover, says the Chazan Ish in Shvius 10.9, someone who meets any one of these criteria is not going to be trusted with regards to tithes. He's not trusted with regards to produce he obtained, that somebody attained from him, and those tithes will be subject to the Demai obligation. And that person is basically going to have the halachic status of an Amor Aretz, and he's going to be treated as such. So there's going to be two themes that come up in the Mishnah and the Gemara. One theme is going to be that, well, what happens if the Amor Aretz grows something? He's the farmer. What's going to be the status of tithes then? Well, the second one that's going to be coming up is what happens if you've gotten this produce from the Amor Aretz, but he's a merchant? What about that? So we're going to be covering that, and basically the theme of what's coming up is going to be a person who is not an Amor Aretz, and he's not going to be trusted regarding tithes unless he's known to be very careful with the tithes. And that's what we're really going to be getting into. And we're going to be getting into what happens if somebody goes over to an Amor Aretz's house. How do you deal with it? So really interesting Mishnah, a lot of really deep, interesting sugyas, a lot of food for thought. This is really like a diamond. The Mishnah starts off and says, someone who wishes to accept upon himself to be trusted with respect to tithes, so that when you get produce from him, basically, it's not going to be Demai, he has to commit to the following practices. By the way, there's an interesting idea that's going to be coming up as a theme here. When he has to commit to these practices, it's not just most of these practices. He has to commit to all of these practices. And that's another theme that comes up in Judaism. What about when somebody converts, when they convert? What happens if they go and they accept everything in the Torah except for one thing? Or what happens if they go to the mikvah and they say, well, I'm not only going to do the Torah things, but I'm not going to do anything or part of the things from Torah Baal Peh. I'll just leave that out. Or, God forbid, even worse, what happens if somebody says, oh, I'll accept all of the Torah things and I'll go accept the Torah Baal Peh, but I'll still believe in my idol? And, well, in all of those cases, they're not a Jew. They didn't actually convert, because when you're going in, you have to accept everything. And it's the same thing here. When you're going to go commit to be trusted regarding tithes, you have to commit to everything. It's not just most of it. And so that's really the theme of what's going to be coming up later on in Halacha 2, 3, 4, 5, where, there's something missing and you have most of it right, but something's missing. That's really what one of the sub-themes is going to be here. So again, the Mishnah says someone who wishes to accept upon himself to be trusted with respect to tithes must commit to all of the following practices. I'm putting that in myself. In other words, so he must accept upon himself to tithe that which he sells. And this, by the way, comes up elsewhere in another Mishnah, where he's gonna also say that he's going to be trusted to sell that tithe which he sells. And we're going to get into the difference between the halachot in the sugya here, between this Mishnah and that Mishnah. But generally speaking, somebody who is going to be obligated to tithe produce before selling it, and somebody who wants to be trusted with regards to tithes has to accept to comply with this part of the law. In other words, before he goes and sells it, he has to go and separate tithes. That's a big part of being trusted and committing to it. The Gemara continues and says, and that which he eats and that which he purchases, and he must accept that he will not be hosted by an Amma Aretz. This, by the way, comes up in a few other halachot in chapter 2. We're really going to be dealing with what happens if you're invited and really you're committing not to eat in the home of an Amma Aretz because the food is not allowed as part of Demai. Ultimately, later on in chapter 2, not in this halacha, one of the primary reasons for not going and eating at a house of an Amma Aretz and not being trusted as for tithes is going to be because of all the Demai materials that could be in the house. An Amma Aretz, he's not going to be careful about food. He's not learned. Certainly, he's not going to be careful about the utensils. And there might be things in the house that might create issues with the roof, where you might have tuma going up and contaminating everything in the roof, because in Amma Aretz, he doesn't know, he's not careful about certain parts of the law, doesn't know about it. So, the tools, the utensils might be tamei and might contaminate the person. Anyway, over here, the question is going to be, over going to a house of an Amma Aretz, is he going to eat this food of Demai? Well, what happens if he's saying, well, I'll do everything. I'll separate out the tithes of Demai, and I'll be trusted, and I'll go to the house of the Amma Aretz, and I'll just separate out tithes. The Mishnah and the Gemara coming up is going to be saying that's not good enough, and that you might be cheating, and certainly the conclusion is going to be elsewhere in chapter 2 that you might just become tamei. And ultimately, that's the reason that you're prohibited, is because you're not careful, not with necessarily the Demai. Even if you're saying, okay, I'll separate out the Demai, no problem. Well, you just made yourself come in contact by coming into a enclosed area with a roof, and you're touching, eating off of tamei utensils. And, an Amma Aretz can tell you it's tamei or tahor, but he's never trusted on it. He's not trusted on tithes, and you can say, okay, well, I'll just separate out the tithes, but, well, congratulations, you just made yourself tamei by, eating off of utensils that, he can't control, and you can't control, and what are you going to do to, fix his utensils? Moreover, what about fixing what was cooked in, the pot? What about cooking in the oven? So you have a lot of problems here with tuma issues, not just saying like, oh, okay, don't worry, I'll be honest and I'll separate out the tithes and everything will be fine. Ultimately, in chapter 2, it's not fine and you're not trusted. So this is one of the criteria. In order to be trusted, you have to not be hosted by an Amma Aretz. And you have to accept that you won't be hosted. That's what the Mishnah says, and there's good reason for it. Rabbi Yehuda says in this Mishnah, one who is hosted by an Amma Aretz is trusted regarding tithes. So the Gemara is going to explain Rabbi Yuda's reason, but the Rosh Sirilio is basically going to be saying that Rabbi Yuda agrees that he must initially commit not to be hosted by the Am Haaretz, and he's going to disagree with the Tanna Kama only regarding someone who made this commitment and later broke it. And according to the Tanna Kama, the person forfeits his trustworthiness, whereas according to Rabbi Yuda, he maintains it. So the Tanna Kama, that's going to be the halacha, and the Tanna Kama are saying that even if you made a commitment and you broke it, and Rabbi Yuda is basically going to be saying for the sake of peace, that it should be okay. Tanna Kama are saying, no, you're still not trusted, and the halacha will go by them. So the Tanna Kama is going to say back in this Mishnah, they're going to say to Rabbi Yuda, since he is not trustworthy with regard to himself, in other words, since he himself will eat food that is Demai, how can he be trusted with regard to the produce he sells to others? In other words, Tanna Kama comes back and says, since the person is not careful with regards to tithes, produce that he gets should also be considered Demai. And they have a very good point. And this, by the way, is even without the Tuma issue. So the Gemara is going to get into it, and it's going to ask, and it's going to say, what does the Mishnah mean when it states that he must commit to tithing that which he purchases? And that's a good question because it comes up elsewhere in a Mishnah. So we're going to learn two different halachot from these two different Mishnahs. One Mishnah is going to mean like this, one Mishnah is going to mean like that. So the Gemara asks, and it says, can it mean that which he purchases in order to eat? And in other words, he's purchasing the food to eat it. And the Gemara continues, says, but we learned in the preceding part of our Mishnah, that's going to be chapter 2, halacha 2 here in Demai, that he must commit to tithing that which he eats. So certainly it looks like it's going to be a copy of the Mishnah to again reiterate and state that he must commit to tithe that which he purchases to eat. So what's going on with this repetition? The Gemara is going to answer and explain the nuance. The Gemara says, rather, the Mishnah means that he must accept upon himself to tithe that which he purchases in order to sell to others. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, but we also learned in a preceding part of our Mishnah that he must commit to tithe that which he sells. And accordingly, he must commit to tithe that which he purchases in order to sell. That's also going to look redundant. So how is this to be reconciled? The Gemara answers and gives you the nuance here, gives you the clue. It says, rather, when the Mishnah teaches that he must commit to tithing that which he purchases, this is referring to when he purchases it in order to sell it. In other words, he's going to be a middleman. He's going to be buying it from an Am Haaretz farmer. He's going to take it. He's going to go to the shuk to do business with it. The Gemara continues, and he's basically saying that this is not redundant because when the Mishnah teaches that he must commit to tithe that which he sells, this refers to when he sells from the produce that he brought in from his own property. In other words, one is talking about when he's a farmer or he farmed his own product, and he's going to go sell it. He has to commit to tithing it. And that's if he's going to be trusted. So let's say you have a backyard porch and you grew some produce on it and you're going to go sell it. Well, you grew that yourself and you don't want to be considered an Am Haaretz, so you have to commit to tithe that. The other Mishnah is talking about if you're going to buy this from a third party and you're going to go sell it to a different third party, and you're going to go to the shuk and you're going to go sell it and you're going to go do business with it. In fact, you never farmed this yourself. What the Gemara is trying to teach is that in this case and this case, you have to tithe it. Whether you farmed it yourself and you're going to go sell it, you have to tithe it. Or whether you purchased it from someone else and you're going to go do business with it and you're going to go sell it at the shuk, you have to go tithe it in both cases. And so it's not redundant. It's just talking about two different cases. So the Gemara is going to get into this other part now about Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara, the Mishnah is stating, Rabbi Yehuda says that one who's hosted by an Am Haaretz is going to be nonetheless trusted with tithes, and the Tana Kama is going to challenge the ruling. And basically they're going to be saying that if a person is known to be untrustworthy, even about himself, he got himself into this kind of situation, and he could even come to eat food that would be Demai, how could he be trusted with regard to produce that he would go to sell to other people? In other words, this guy didn't really commit to all of these practices. He came to eat Demai. Ultimately, it's going to be coming up that he came to contaminate himself, so that, he made himself ultimately, not in this Gemara, but ultimately, it's going to be coming up later in chapter 2, he made himself Demai voluntarily by eating on these dishes or eating food that wasn't cooked in a tahor pot or in a tahor oven. And so now when he goes home to sell produce and separate it and, and sell it, he contaminates it. So, and even in his own home, he contaminates it when he's handling it. So it's a problem. So the Gemara is gonna look at Rabbi Yehuda's answer to the challenge. Again, Halacha is not going to go by Rabbi Yehuda, but we want to know what Rabbi Yehuda thinks. And the Gemara says that it was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, in all the days of householders who accepted upon themselves to be careful with regards to tithes, they did not refrain from being hosted by other householders who were their friends, even though those friends were Amoratzim. So he's talking about a historical thing here. And the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is going to be saying that we see that people who had committed to be careful with tithes would remain scrupulous with produce in their own homes, despite the fact that they would eat in the houses of Amoratzim. And therefore, a person who is hosted by an Am Haaretz should not forfeit the legal status of being considered trustworthy, so that his produce should be considered Demai. That's what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is explaining here. He's not saying that this is a halacha. He's trying to explain what this means. And the Gemara continues and says, they did not refrain from being hosted by other householders who were their friends. Nevertheless, they in fact conducted themselves carefully with their own produce and made sure that it should be tithed in their own homes. Consequently, even people who are hosted by Amoratzim should be trusted with regards to tithes. So why would they be careful about this? They're trying to keep the peace. That's why they're accepting these invitations. They're trying to keep the peace. So the Gemara is going to cite a dispute regarding how Rabbi Yehuda explains the behavior of these people who are careful with regards to tithes in their home, yet they're going to go eat at the house of an Am Haaretz. How can it be? So Rabbi Yonah says people who are friendly with the Am Haaretz and they eat at their homes are not suspected of actually eating Demai, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And this is why they are not suspected of feeding this kind of food to others. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is going to continue the explanation here. And he's going to be saying that when, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when he eats at the home of the Am Haaretz, he in fact remains careful with regards to tithes, and he's not going to eat Demai. And, regarding, he's going to tithe, the produce himself before eating it at their house. That's effectively what he's going to be saying. And the Chazan Ish is going to explain it like this. He's going to say that Rabbi Yehuda is trying to explain that he eats the food because he knows that the host will tithe the produce before he serves it to the Chaver, out of personal friendliness to him. In other words, either he's going to tithe the food himself, or it's going to be assumed that the householder is going to know that he's a Chaver and he's going to have respect for him and he's going to tithe it to also keep the peace. He's also going to keep the peace. That's what Rabbi Yuda's point is. So, certainly this is a dispute as to how, Rabbi Yuda is going to explain the behavior of these people who are going to be careful with regards to tithes at their own home, but somehow they're going to go eat at the house of an Am Haaretz. How can this be? And Rabbi Yonah is going to explain that people who are friendly with the Am Haaretz and will eat in their home are not going to be suspected of actually eating Demai, according to Rabbi Yudah. And that's why we're not going to be worried about him feeding. In other words, that either the Am Haaretz is going to separate the tithes and tell him and be careful about it. But, again, we understand that we can't trust the Am Haaretz, but somehow Rabbi Yudah is saying that, at this time there must be so much respect for somebody who's keeping these tithes that they're going to, even though they're an Am Haaretz, they're going to go and separate the tithes properly. Or that the person who knows better is going to know it's Demai and separate it. There's a dissenting view, obviously. Rabbi Yosei says people who are friendly with Am Haaretzim and therefore eat in their homes are suspected of eating Demai, but they are nevertheless, according to Rabbi Yudah, not suspected of feeding food that is not tithed to others. So, according to this explanation by Rabbi Yosei, as explained by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, according to this explanation of Rabbi Yudah's position, the person is not trusted to feed others Demai, even though he himself has eaten it at the home of Am Haaretz. And this is because Rabbi Yudah stated in the Brisa, and we see that people who are hosted by the Am Haaretzim, in fact, remain careful with regards to tithes in their own home. And therefore, we're forced to explain that they eat Demai in the homes of the Am Haaretz only because they're embarrassed to decline the food or to tithe it in front of them themselves. And, it's a big question as to, eating this kind of food in front of others. It's kind of lacking a backbone, not only to accept this invite, but also to eat it in front of them. So the Gemara is going to ask a question, and it's going to say, our Mishnah contradicts Rabbi Yosei. And the Mishnah cited the Tanna Kama's challenge to Rabbi Yudah. And they said to Rabbi Yudah, since he's not trustworthy with regards to himself, in other words, the real point by the Tanna Kama is not really by Rabbi Yosei. The Tanna Kama are saying, since he himself eats the food that's Demai, how can he be trusted to, with regards to produce that he sells to other people? And the Gemara is going to understand that against Rabbi Yossi's explanation of Rabbi Yudah's position. And the Tanna Kama is definitely going to be disagreeing with Rabbi Yudah's position. And, it's basically going to be saying that a person who eats in the house of Am Haaretz is, even if he's not suspected of actually eating the Demai because he was not careful, how could he be careful with regards to the produce he sells, that he himself sells? He has to accept all of these conditions, and he didn't accept all of these conditions. So maybe he's not so careful with what he sells. Now, the Gemara is going to go back to Rabbi Yossi's point. Again, let's look at Rabbi Yossi's point. Rabbi Yossi's point says that Rabbi Yossi says people who are friendly with Am Haaretzim and therefore eat in their homes are suspected of eating Demai, but they are nevertheless, according to Rabbi Yudah, not suspected of feeding food that is not tithed to others. So Rabbi Yossi is trying to explain Rabbi Yudah's point. And again, Tanna Kama doesn't even accept Rabbi Yossi's point and doesn't accept Rabbi Yossi's explanation of Rabbi Yudah's point. Again, Rabbi Yossi's position here is going to be to explain Rabbi Yuda's point that, people who are hosted by the Amoratzim, according to Rabbi Yossi, are going to be careful with regards to tithes at home. And so, they're embarrassed to decline the food or to tithe it in front of them, even though they weren't careful themselves. They'll be careful when they sell it. So the Gemara is going to try to find support for Rabbi Yossi's view. And again, Rabbi Yossi's view here is trying to explain the Tana's position here. So the Gemara continues and says that the words of the following rabbis support Rabbi Yossi. It says, for Rabbi Chanina says in the name of Rabbi Yasu, who says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yuda only stated his position that even a person hosted by an Amoraretz is going to be trusted with regards to tithes at the end. In other words, when he's no longer the guest of the Amoraretz. But initially, when he is still a guest of the Amoraretz, even Rabbi Yuda would agree that he's not trusted. And this ruling is going to be where initially he's still going to be the guest of the Amoraretz. So the Gemara says even Rabbi Yuda agrees that he's not trusted. So in this way, this ruling of the rabbis would actually support Rabbi Yossi's interpretation for the following reason. In other words, Rabbi Kanievsky is going to explain this nuance like this. He's going to say, if while he's a guest in the house of the Amoraretz, he gives or he sells someone food, Rabbi Yuda is going to agree that the recipient may not rely on the food as already being tithed, so he would tithe it himself. So he comes to the house, he's not going to trust, even if the guy says, okay, I tithed it for you, I want to keep the peace, don't worry, it's tithed. He's saying that the Chaver has to tithe it himself anyway. He's not allowed to trust it. And so, he went to the house of the Amoraretz, and he's going to go tithe it himself. So the rabbis are going to support Rabbi Yossi's interpretation for the following reason. The Gemara is going to say, if you say, as Rabbi Yonah explained, the opinion of Rabbi Yudah, that people who are friendly with the Amoraretz and eat in their house is not going to be suspected of actually eating Demai when they eat there. In other words, they're going to say that, okay, even if you gave me the food and you're going to say it's tithe, I separated out the tithes myself in front of you. The Gemara says, and this is going to be the reason they're not suspected of feeding the food to others. In other words, they're going to say that they're still going to be careful in the house to tithe the food even in front of the other people. The Gemara is going to continue and say, then what is the difference between initially when the person is in the house of the Amoraretz and the end when he returns home? In other words, what's the difference if he's going to tithe it in the house of the Amoraretz, or he's going to tithe it when he gets home and he sells it to other people? Either way, he's going to be selling. He's always going to be tithing the food. What's the problem here? And in other words, we should be able to trust him in either case because he's always going to be tithing it. And, really what this is saying is if we assume that even when he's in the house of the Amoraretz, he does not eat Demai and he's gonna tithe it, then, why wouldn't it be when, he gets home, he shouldn't be suspected either. He should be tithing it as well. So that's actually not going to be the halacha. Halacha is not going to be like that because underlying there, it's going to be a big set of problems. In other words, that doesn't go far enough. So if we assume that when he's in the home of the Amoraretz, he's not actually eating any Demai, what's the problem with him being trusted later on? Why isn't he just trusted when he's at the house of the Amoraretz?
And the rabbis are trying to point out that he's not trusted while in the home of the Am Haaretz, and that's going to, in fact, imply that we have to suspect him of eating Demai in that house. And if he's not careful with tithes over there, certainly when he's going to return home, the question is, are we going to be able to trust him on, tithing produce that he's going to be able to sell? And why wouldn't it be that we would just, trust him only once he gets home and not trust him earlier? That's going to be the big question. And why is it that the opinion of the rabbis is going to carry over to say, no, you're not only just not trusted over here at the house of the Am Haaretz, but, now you weren't careful with tithes, and now you're going to maybe separate, maybe not separate, and then go sell to other people. You can't be trusted. You're not trustworthy. That's a big question. In other words, why is it that there's not a cutoff that says that, okay, maybe now that, he's out of that environment and now he comes home, maybe you can trust him now. Maybe it's kind of like a type of tshuva. But the sages are not saying that. The sages are really saying that, no, really, it's going to be limited not only to, the first time he's eating it at this house, but also in this later time as well. Now, the Gemara wants to look at a brisa regarding a person who does not follow all of the practices mentioned in the Mishnah. And again, that's what this is about. This is about following all of the practices listed in the Mishnah to be a trusted individual. So the brisa says that it was taught in a brisa, if someone accepts upon himself to be trusted with respect to tithes, except for one matter, and it says we do not accept him. In other words, it's like he's saying, okay, I'm going to accept all the practices in the Mishnah, but not that one. I'm just not doing that one. He doesn't count as being a Chaver. He doesn't count as being trusted. And the same, by the way, parallels over with conversion. If somebody says, okay, I'm going to convert, I'm going to come and I'm going to accept 613 mitzvot, but I'm not accepting this and this rabbinic interpretation on it, it doesn't count. Or he says, okay, I'm only accepting 612 mitzvot. This one I'm not doing. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not how Judaism works. So that's going to be the idea here as well. If you want to be regarded as trusted, you have to accept all of it. And coming in and making an exception of just even one of these issues is going to make it where we do not accept him. And we're not going to consider him trustworthy with regards to the tithes. In other words, says Rabbi Kanievsky about this, that he's not trusted even with regard to a practice that he has accepted upon himself. In other words, let's say he didn't accept one of these things in the Mishnah. We can just pick one at random. Let's take a look and let's pick one. So let's say that he says, okay, I'm just not going to accept the one not to be hosted by the Am Haaretz, but certainly I'm going to tithe what I sell. I'm going to certainly, whatever I eat, I'm going to tithe. Whatever I purchase, I'm going to tithe. But I'm just not going to, if an Am Haaretz invites me to keep the peace, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to accept what the sages say. I'm going to accept the invite. Rabbi Kanievsky is explaining about this that, let's say now he comes along and says, well, I sell this, tithed product at the shuk and, come and trust me. And he's saying, no, we don't trust him. And this is exactly what the sages are saying. We don't trust him because he didn't keep one of these in the list. And we don't trust him because how do you know he's not going to be lax on these other things? How do you know he's really keeping all of it? And let's say he says, no, I really am. I'm keeping all of this. I'm very strict on it. This is just the one I don't keep. We don't regard it. And so, you fall into the category as well as being an Am Haaretz for regards to trustworthiness of tithes. And we already learned earlier that somebody who has the status of an Amma Aretz is not trusted when he says, oh, I separated these or I didn't separate these. He's not regarded. So if he's not going to be falling into the category of being a Chaver and being accepted and trusted, and by the way, there's an opinion about this that you actually have to go to the Bet Din and make this declaration in front of a Bet Din, and that it's like you've been licensed to actually handle this kind of product. Anyway, there's a formality to it. And, it's very serious to, go to a Bet Din and to speak the truth and not to go to a Bet Din and lie. So if you really go to a Bet Din and making this declaration, you're going to do it and you're going to accept all of these, you have to really accept all of these. But if you're falling in this category where you're just not going to accept one of these, right? And you're going to say really strongly, like, don't worry, I'm going to really tithe this product. Don't worry. Well, the idea is that you're not trustworthy, right? That's the point. The point is that if you're not trustworthy about one of these, then you fall into the category of the Am Aretz. And anyway, the Am Aretz, we don't trust him if he says he tithed it. So, the logic of where the rabbis are coming from is very consistent here. And, you can understand it very easily. Already he's not trustworthy. He falls into the category of the Am Aretz. And anyway, the Am Aretz, we don't listen to what he says. So it doesn't matter that he says he tithed it and he's very strict about it. So the Gemara continues and says, similarly, one who is suspect regarding one matter is suspect regarding everything. In other words, we don't trust him with regard to any of the tithing practices. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say something a little different. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is going to be that if someone is suspect regarding one matter, he is suspect regarding only that matter alone, but he can be trusted regarding to the tithing practices that he committed. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky explains in his Beur shiurim like this. He says, if, for example, this suspect is going to be, suspected with regards to the tithing that he buys. In other words, he's gonna get produce that is Demai. He still may be trusted to tithe that which he grows himself. That's what Rabbi Yehuda's point is, according to Rabbi Kanievsky. Now, obviously, Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with the Tanna Kama here, and he's disagreeing in this second case of the Brisa. He, by the way, is going to be agreeing with the first ruling of the Brisa that if a person did not initially commit to the entire list of practices, he is not considered trustworthy. And according to the Rosh Cirilio about this, according to how Rabbi Yosei is going to explain earlier in this Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda's ruling in this Mishnah that a person remains trustworthy even if he eats in the home of the Am Aretz, it's simply an example of his ruling here. And that's going to be that someone who violates any one of the tithing practices remains trustworthy regarding the other practices. And according to Rabbi Yonah, though, someone who eats Demai does in fact lose his trustworthiness. So this, by the way, comes up in other cases of the Halacha. You can find this in Sanhedrin. So the cases over there are going to go like this. Well, what happens if somebody is deemed in monetary laws to be untrustworthy as a witness with regard to one specific category of halacha? Then, are you able to listen to him if you have a different matter that comes to court that's not a monetary issue? So, for instance, let's say you have a capital case in the court, and you have a case where this person is known not to be trustworthy in a monetary issue. Now, this person comes and testifies in the capital issue. Do you regard his testimony or not? Or do you say, hey, this is not a trustworthy witness at all, because over here he's not trustworthy in the monetary issue, so how can we trust him over here in a capital case? But the halacha in Sanhedrin doesn't go that way. The final ruling over there is going to be that, you don't trust him over there in the case of the monetary issue, But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a capital issue, capital case. So you can regard his testimony in the capital case, just not a monetary case. And I believe that Rabbi Yudah is coming and taking the same approach. He's saying that, you're not trusted in this one aspect. That's fine, but you have these other aspects in the list of the Mishnah, and so maybe you're not trustworthy on this part, but if you're trustworthy in these other parts, you can still be reliable, and that also fits with the Torah Baal Peh in terms of what we see over there in Sanhedrin. So what's going to be the difference? Now, the halacha l'maisa is not going to be going by Rabbi Yudah here against the sages. It's going to be going by the sages. So we're gonna continue this, and the Mishnah taught that someone who becomes trusted with regards to tithes by formally committing to the tithing practices, the Gemara is going to talk about it another way, that somebody can be considered trustworthy. Now again, Rabbi Yudah's position is going to be that if he's going to court and he's making a declaration that he wants to be a Chaver and be trusted, he has to accept all of the list in the Mishnah. Nobody disputes that. And if he says, I'm not going to accept this one, then he's not regarded as trustworthy. Even Rabbi Yudah is going to agree that. But if you have a case where he lapsed on one of these issues, like not to be hosted by an Amaretz, well, you would say, Rabbi Yudah would say, well, you could trust him over here on these other 4 issues, just not on this case here. Again, that's not going to be the halacha. So the Gemara continues and says, it was taught in the Baraisa, one who is trustworthy regarding Tahoros is trusted regarding Maisros. And that's without having to make a formal declaration that we talk about in this Mishnah. Now, this Baraisa is referring to someone who is known to keep the rabbinic stringencies of Tahoros. That means that he's going to be eating, even chulin only if it's tahor. And, since he's known to be very, very careful to this rabbinic requirement, you can assume that he's also going to be careful with regards to tithing. Why? Because tithing is a biblical obligation. That's doraita. And so if you see somebody who is being careful with rabbinic stringencies on tahoros, you can assume that he's going to be stringent also on these doraita ones. It makes a lot of sense. Now, the Brisa is going to get refined, and Rabbi Yanai, the son of Rabbi Ishmael, teaches in this Brisa and says the following explanation. It says, this ruling was stated regarding someone who is hosted by the person who is trusted regarding Tahoros. And publicly, says the Gemara, he is not trusted when he says that something is tithed, unless he publicly accepts upon himself to abide by the laws of the tithes, as we saw in the Mishnah. So over here, the commentary of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is going to say that the Mishnah's ruling that making a formal commitment is the standard, so that anyone who does not make this formal commitment is not going to be trusted in public. And privately, however, one may trust a person who is known to him to be religiously careful. And that's how Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's understanding what this Bryce is saying. And Mara Fulda is going to explain that if a person did not make a formal commitment, that's, by the way, described by the Mishnah, one can trust him for maestros only when he is the guest in his house, in private. And such a person may not be declared trustworthy in public, which would allow everybody to purchase from him and presume that it's going to be tithed produce, unless he's going to go and make this formal commitment. And over there, if he's making a formal commitment, again, he's going to court, and he's going to the court to make a declaration. So the Gemara is going to give a related teaching, and I know that when you see this, you're going to say, "Oh, I would have asked this question at some point as well." So the Gemara that's coming up goes like this. Rabbi Ami says in the name of Rabbi Yanai, "Even I am not trusted regarding tithes, unless I accept upon myself in public to abide by the tithing regulations, despite the fact that I'm a Torah scholar." So you'd say, wait a second. What about a Torah scholar? What about a guy who sits and learns? What about an avrech, right? The Pnei Moshe says about this that this is trying to teach that even a Torah scholar is not trusted with regard to tithes unless he makes a formal public commitment to adhere to the tithing practices. So really what Rabbi Ami is saying in the name of Rabbi Yanai, he's trying to say that and by the way, Rabbi Yanai was the teacher of Rabbi Yochanan. So he's one of his rebbes. So he's trying to say that this is really the tradition. This is really the way it is. You really have to go, even if you're Rabbi Yanai, go make a formal declaration. And you'd say, but wait a second, you're a great Torah scholar. You're Gadol Gador. And why isn't that we just don't trust you? And basically what this is trying to say is that even though I'm a Torah scholar, we have this tradition that people are not trusted regarding tithes unless they go and they make a public declaration. This is what it is. Why would that be? Why would that have to be? Well, we've seen that you have in Jewish history, you've had rebellious sages, and you have the cases of Zak and Memory. You also have the stories of Rabbi Meir's teacher. Rabbi Meir's teacher basically went off the derech. One of his teachers went off the derech, and he knew everything. He was a great Torah scholar. I mean, he knew a lot of Torah, even when the teacher went off the derech. Rabbi Meir was still trying to engage with him and get him to make tshuva, but still trying to hear what he has to say and trying to engage with him. And over there in those stories of Rabbi Meir's teacher, the guy would go and break Yom Kippur. So the guy really went off the derech. So even though he was a Torah scholar, he was obviously breaking things that are even more serious than separating tithes. He's breaking Yom Kippur things in public. So just because you're a Torah scholar doesn't mean that that should be a waiver. In other words, you have to go out and you have to make a formal declaration that you're going to keep these laws. So there's another related ruling, and Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yassa say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that even a Chaver sends produce to another Chaver, he has to go and tithe it as Demai. Now, this gets back to what we learned earlier in the story in chapter 2, Halacha 1 with Rabbi Zera, where one person went and sent Rabbi Zera food gifts, and this person was a Torah scholar, and Rabbi Zera assumed that the Torah scholar would have tithed it, and the person who sent it was a Torah scholar sending it to a Torah scholar and assuming that Rabbi Zera knew that he should tithe it. And so what happened? Rabbi Zera ended up eating it where it wasn't tithed because both made these assumptions that the other guy would tithe it. So we see here, ultimately, Rabbi Zera is teaching in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And by the way, this case with Rabbi Zera must have happened, early on in the tutelage, his tutelage with Rabbi Yochanan, and certainly not later. And that's why Rabbi Zera is coming later on to teach what Rabbi Yochanan ultimately said, which is that even a Chaver, when he sends produce to another Chaver, the recipient has to tithe it as Demai. So very fitting for Rabbi Zera. Effectively, Rabbi Yochanan is saying to his student, you got this, you are supposed to tithe it, not assume that the Torah scholar who sent it to you tithed it. So the Gemara now is going to relate another ruling with Rabbi Zera, and Rabbi Zera asks before Rabbi Yasa and says, if someone such as me who is careful with regards to Tuma and Tahara sends produce to Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, or if Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, who is known to be just as careful, sends produce to me, does the recipient nonetheless tithe the produce? Now, this seems like a very strange question, and why would it be he's asking this seemingly strange question? The Chazan Ish says about this that the Gemara is talking about the obligation of the recipient of a gift to tithe it despite the fact that it was sent by a trustworthy individual. Now, this is going to be getting into a nuance that we might not have detected without the Gemara's coming up. Rabbi Yasa responds and really is trying to get at, why is Rabbi Zera asking about this Torah scholar who's very careful, known to be very careful? What's he trying to imply, right? So Rabbi Yasa says to Rabbi Zera, what are you asking about Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak? In other words, what's your implication here? Why are you saying, if somebody got tithes from this guy, what do you do about it? Or if you send tithes to this guy, what do you do about it? Why are you asking about this guy, right? Rabbi Zera is going to clarify this because it does sound a little bit funny. And he says like this. He says, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak is unique in that whatever he eats, it's from the marketplace. And what Rabbi Zera is trying to ask, and by the way, there's no resolution to this, is that, when it comes into the possession of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, he bought it at the market, okay? And so he never actually grew the product himself. And normally you'd say, well, maybe I'm sending to Rabbi Zera and I grew it in my garden and I'm going to tithe it because I grew it in my garden and I'm sending to Rabbi Zera. Or I know that Rabbi Zera is, scrupulous with tithes and he's a recipient and I grew it in my garden and I'm going to send these zucchinis to him. But this is different. This is saying, no, he got this in the market. And when you're buying it at the market, it has to be tithed. It needs to be tithed as Demai, but it needs to be tithed. Okay, and really what Rabbi Zera is trying to ask about this is that even a person who is known to be careful about things with Tuma and Tahara, can he be trusted regarding tithes? And would that apply if this person is getting produce that is not definite tevel? And so, he's not growing the produce. He's just purchasing it at the market. And the product at the market is going to be subject to the obligation of Demai. And that's going to be a rabbinic obligation. So, one might be permitted to rely on this careful person to tithe it. That's really what it's saying. It's saying, look, this guy's careful on these rabbinic things like, taharos. That's fine. And I know, by the way, this guy only doesn't grow anything. Everything he gets is from the market. And we know that Demai is going to be Derabanan as well. So really, Rabbi Zera is saying, if I know he's careful on, taharos, can I, trust that he would have tithed the Demai that he purchased at the market, which he's supposed to do. So rather than me go and separate the tithes, effectively Rabbi Zera is asking, can I rely on this person? And the Gemara doesn't answer it. It leaves it unresolved. It's a good question for when the Mashiach comes, because you could see it both ways. So the Gemara now is going to talk about another brisa. It's going to say, if someone is trustworthy regarding tithes, but his wife is not trustworthy, people may purchase produce from him, but they may not be hosted by him. Why? Because the food that's served in his house is going to be prepared by his wife, and his wife is not trustworthy on tithes. The Gemara says, however, the sages said, the husband is like someone living together with a snake in the basket. So the Rosh Sirilio explains this and says, although you can live in close proximity to a snake for a long time, and you might not even get bitten, But eventually, you're going to let your guard down. The snake is going to bite you. And likewise, the husband in this case might, not be careful, and he might accidentally eat untithed produce. So this is really the sages saying that, you really shouldn't be living with this kind of woman. And moreover, you can't trust the husband because, maybe he says he's careful with tithes. Maybe he is, but at some point he'll let his guard down and he'll eat it. And then he becomes untrustworthy. So there's another teaching in the Brisa. It says if someone's wife is trustworthy regarding tithes, but the husband is not trustworthy, it says that people may be hosted by him. Why? Because the food is going to be prepared by the wife. The wife is trustworthy. She can go make a declaration, by the way, at the Bet Din or Sanhedrin just as well as a man. Both can go and make a testimony. That's one thing that the Bryce is teaching. Another thing that the Bryce is teaching is the inverse. We're looking at the person who prepares the food. Who's preparing the food? Is the person preparing the food, treating things in a kosher way or not? And the Gemara says, but they may not purchase from him because he is not trustworthy. However, the sages said, let a curse come upon someone whose wife is trustworthy, but he is not trustworthy. Now, you're not allowed to go curse people. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein explains this as says that he deserves to be cursed for not learning from his wife's example to be trustworthy on tithes. And another way to look at this is going to be that, this kind of curse is going to be put by the sages as a motivation to try to get the people to do better in these kinds of situations. And then we're going to finish up with the last Baraisa in Halacha 2, chapter 2. So the Gemara continues and says, it was taught in a Baraisa that a Chaver may not serve as a waiter at a party of an Amma Aretz, nor at a meal of an Amma Aretz, unless everything is rectified and tithed while in his possession. In other words, before they go ahead and they serve it. So the Gemara continues and says, even the wine siphon, and consequently, says the Gemara, if a Chaver served as a waiter at a party of the Amma Aretz or at a meal of an Amma Aretz, there's a presumption with regards to tithes. In other words, the guests are permitted to assume that the Chaver tithed everything that's served at the party. And so basically, it's saying that a Chaver may not serve as a waiter at a party of the Amma Aretz unless everything is already tithed while it's in his possession. And in other words, before it gets served. In other words, the Chaver has to get permission from the Amma Aretz to be able to handle the tithes. And that's part of the condition of serving as a waiter at this party, is that unless the Chaver is going to be given the ability to do tithes, the Chaver is not allowed to go and take this event. So the Brisa continues and says, if they saw a Chaver merely eating at the party or a meal of the Amma Aretz, there's no presumption that the food or drink found there would be tithed. So again, let's say you saw at this party a Chaver and he's eating. Well, how do you know he didn't go off the derech? Just because he's eating there and he was known to be trusted, that's not enough. That's not enough proof that everything has been tithed. And in fact, I've heard many stories, unfortunately, in New York City, of Hasidim who've gone off the derech and will go eat at treif restaurants while still wearing the clothing of the Hasidim. And it's a big Hilul Hashem, but nonetheless, there are many stories like that, and I've heard the stories like that firsthand from my brother, who went to Meir Yeshiva and lives in Brooklyn and has seen it many times. And it's a shocking story, and I've heard it from a couple other rabbis in Brooklyn who saw also such a thing. So just because you see a Chaver there eating at a party or meal, and it's at the meal of an Amma Aretz, you can't presume that everything's been tithed. And likewise, just because you see some Hasidic guys eating at a treif restaurant, you can't assume the food's kosher. So you would say, in this party of the Am Haaretz, and you see it's one thing for the waiter, right? The waiter, part of the job is, as we saw in this brisa, he has to get control over the food in order to tithe it. But over here, we're talking about physically seeing a chaver go and eating. So the Gemara continues, again, we're finishing up. It says, I say that perhaps he's eating the food without having physically tithed it, and instead he's, using tithing stipulations he made in his mind, which are only effective for his only portion. So the Gemara is trying to think good about the Jew there. And, with Meiser Shani, as also part of the Demai tithe, that doesn't need to be physically separated. It could be designated and then, even mentally, and then, redeemed with money. The Brisa continues further and says, if the Chaver's son is eating with him at the Am Haaretz's party, the Chaver must tithe the son's food for him. Since the father is obligated to do so, the son is permitted to rely on his father and is not required to tithe the food himself. And the Gemara finishes up and says, if, however, his friend is eating with him at the party or the meal of the Am Haaretz, the Chaver does not need to tithe the friend's food for him. Consequently, a friend must tithe the food for himself. So over here, the Chaver does not need to be worried about the friend because, the friend has to take care of himself. And, the Brisa here, talking about the son, is talking about a minor. And, father does not need to tithe on behalf of his son if the son is an adult. So clearly it's talking about a minor son. And the Brisa here about eating at this kind of party for the Chaver, the Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that the Brisa is remarking that if someone observes the Chaver and does not appear to have tithed the food during the meal, you can nonetheless not assume that he tithed the food in advance, and he may be employing this procedure about the mental tithing to tithe his food without doing the physical action. And since this procedure effectively tithes only his portion, you can't, as a guest, assume that your portion has been tithed. So the Chaver has a way at the party to handle the tithes for himself, but when you see him over there eating, you can't assume that your food has been tithed, and you can't assume that he's done something on his plate on behalf of your plate. That's what this is trying to say. So we're going to go on to Halacha 3 tomorrow, and we're going to learn more about what it means to accept on yourself to be a Chaver. Have a great day.